Hi, I'm Mandy Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer, and this is another video in our series entitled Mistaken Identity for Forms. And today we're talking about the mistaken identity, kind of mistaken use between 22B, the home sale contingency, and 22Q, the pending sale contingency. And there's probably a variety of different scenarios we could really address, speaking of the confusion between these forms. But here's what I want to really get at, because this is one of the most dangerous things that I see brokers do when they've got on either side of the transaction with a 22B buyer. So buyer brokers, listing brokers, I'm talking to both of you. Anytime you're in a transaction where the buyer has a 22B home sale contingency in the agreement. Here's what sometimes happens, and it is wrong. Buyer succeeds in selling their home. That's right. That's good. Buyer sells their home. They get a buyer for their home. And then, instead of letting the 22B do its job, because the 22B can competently do the job from mutual acceptance to closing in this transaction, it doesn't need any help along the way. But too often brokers decide that 22B only does the job from mutual acceptance until the time seller sells their home. And then too many brokers mistakenly believe that at the point the buyer sells their home, the brokers are then supposed to insert a 22Q into the transaction. That is absolutely wrong. And when you do that, you introduce into one transaction two forms with conflicting terms. For example, 22B creates one closing date for the transaction. 22Q creates a different closing date for the transaction. If they're both in the form, what's the closing date of the transaction? Who knows? Because the brokers, who are held to the standard of care of a lawyer, when of course they select the forms, selected forms to use in this transaction that create conflicting terms as to when the closing date is. Brokers never, ever, 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 ever include a 22Q or inject a 22Q into a 22B transaction. It is a bright line rule. There is never, ever a time when a 22B transaction needs a 22Q. If you have questions on this topic or any other, log into the Legal Hotline at warealtor.org and ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.